Well, there is the possibility of providing a minimum income. The question, what will that do, is completely unanswerable. We have no idea what it'll do. And I mean, it might stop people from starving to death, although I wouldn't say in North America that's generally not a problem people have anyways. But we don't know. See, I think of human beings as pack animals fundamentally, and this is just, it's a metaphor in some sense. I don't think that people can be happy unless they are burdened down with something, like a sled dog is burdened down with something. You have to have responsibilities. They have to be important responsibilities. You have to be sequenced in your time. Most of the people I have in my clinical practice, if they're not employed, they just fall apart. And the conscientious ones fall apart because they eat themselves up with shame and guilt. And the unconscientious ones fall apart because their sleep schedule goes all over the place. They don't eat regularly anymore. They do all sorts of impulsive things that are counterproductive. And they just sort of spiral into a pool of meaninglessness. So human beings are pretty social, and we're pretty altruistic, in some weird manner. And it doesn't seem to me that people can live a life that's acceptable if all they have is enforced leisure. So maybe that'll be wrong. If you provided people with a base salary, maybe people would figure out what to do with their spare time. But I doubt it. I don't think people are. I think it's very, very difficult for people to regulate themselves in the absence of a certain minimum of social structuring and guidance. I've seen very, very few people who can conjure that up on their own and manage it for extensive periods of time. I think I've only met one person, I would say, in my whole life who's actually managed that. And that particular person has a very large array of talents and is extremely intelligent.
An often heard objection against a libertarian socialist society is that no one would bother to work in it. Do you think that's a valid objection? What about those that don't want to work?
Well, it's an interesting concept. Actually, this is one of the things in which I've differed for some time on with the Paracon people. Mm. They basically have the same view. Mike Albert, Robin Hannell, and the others, we've disagreed about this for many years. It's a question of what you think work is. I mean, there is a point of view associated with capitalist systems that holds that work is a burden. If you weren't driven to work, you'd prefer to vegetate. I don't think that has anything to do with human beings. And in fact, it's kind of striking that the people who hold this view, most of them come from the university or scientific backgrounds. Well, you go into, say, the university where I work, MIT, mainly scientific university, and people are working 80 hours a day, 80 hours a week, because they love their work. And their work is under their own control. Of all the social institutions, these, especially science-based universities, are places where you really do control your own work. I mean, you got to meet some conditions, but it's pretty much controlled by participants. So, optimally and in fact often realistically. And under those conditions, people just want to work. They're carpenters who love what they're doing and can control it. They work all the time. And in fact, there's an old tradition from the Enlightenment, which is grew into classical liberalism and finally anarchism, which holds that work is should be one of the highest ideals of life. Creative work under your own control. And I think most people know that that's true. When you have an opportunity to do creative work under your own control, especially if it has some social purpose and so on, it's the best thing to do. It's a lot better than lying on a couch and watching a boring television program. So I just think it's it's a concept of work that comes out of capitalist ideology, which says people have to be driven to work. Actually, it's very interesting to watch the debates about this. It's debated in mainstream circles, not so much in these terms, but take a look at the debates about taxing taxation of the wealthy. The standard argument against taxing the wealthy is, well, if you put high taxes on the wealthy, they're not going to do anything. And they're the ones who invest and make things happen and so on and so forth. Now, the people who press this most are economists. And sometimes it's almost comical. There was an article, one of the major journals, by a well-known Harvard economist, liberal economist, Greg Mankiw, wrote the major texts. And he argued, he said, look, you can't, he's kind of a liberal, he says you can't tax the rich because they're not going to do anything. And then there's no economic theory behind it or any other theory, but he gives an example of himself. He says, well, if I didn't have a high salary, I wouldn't do anything. You'd never get anyone in a university saying that except from an economics department. And that's because the ideology is so built in, they can't think. They can't look at the next office and see that the guy's in the lab all day because he loves what he's doing. Of course, people want to do meaningful work, especially if they can run it themselves. The Paracon position that I've disagreed with is they believe that remuneration ought to be proportional to input. You know, the harder you work, the more you should be paid. But I think that's a very demeaning conception of not only of what work is, but what human beings are like. And I don't even think it's true. You know, in fact, they themselves work very hard and they don't get paid for it. So are they different from other